I see a lot of advice telling aspiring cybersecurity professionals to build a home lab. I also see a lot of candidates who build elaborate labs but still can't get hired. The problem isn't that the advice is completely wrong. The problem is that building a lab and having meaningful experience are not the same. If you can't explain what problem you were investigating, what decisions you made, and what you learned when things didn't work as expected, you haven't really built experience. You've just been busy. And that matters because you're competing against hundreds of other candidates who also build home labs and also earn Security Plus or CEH certifications, and also completed TryHackMe or Hack in the Box modules. Hiring managers can't differentiate between you based on activities alone. As far as the real problem here is, you know, here's what makes this just so frustrating, right? Entry-level cybersecurity positions routinely require 2 to 3 years of experience. Internships prefer candidates who already have technical skills. Even junior SOC analyst roles expect familiarity with SIM platforms, incident response procedures, and security frameworks. You can't get experience without a job, but you can't get a job without experience. So people tell you to build a home lab, complete online training platforms, earn more certifications, contribute to open source projects. That advice isn't wrong, but it's just incomplete. Because completing these activities doesn't automatically translate into something hiring managers recognize as experience. Let's go ahead and dig a little deeper into this, right, and kind of show you what I mean. So what hiring managers actually see, you know, when I review portfolios or conduct interviews, I see hundreds of resumes listing home labs. Most describe elaborate environments with virtualization platforms, multiple operating systems, security tools, network configurations. Very few candidates can explain what problems they investigated in those labs, what decisions they made, that failed. Lab. I want to know what problem they were trying to solve, why they chose their specific approach, what alternatives they considered, what surprised them about the results as well. Most candidates describe what they build, but can't explain why they made specific decisions. They followed the guide, they completed the steps, they got it working. Then they moved on to the next tutorial, right? That's activity completion. It's not really experience. I've seen this when comparing candidates for the same security position. One candidate had an impressive looking home lab. They had a SIM, multiple virtual machines, vulnerability scanners, Active Directory environment, and a long list of tools they had worked with. But when I started asking questions about it, most of what they had done came from tutorials. They could tell me the steps they followed, but they struggled when I asked why they configured something a certain way. What went wrong, or what would they change if they had to do it again. Another candidate had a much simpler project. Nothing particularly impressive, on paper, but they had documented the entire thing. They could explain the problem that they were trying to solve, why they chose the tool they use, what they expected to happen, and most importantly, what happened when something didn't work. They showed me where they made a mistake, how they figured out what was wrong, and what they learned from fixing it. If I'm evaluating those two candidates, the second one gives me much more evidence of how they're going to perform on the job. That's the part people miss when they're told to build a home lab. The lab isn't the experience, the troubleshooting, decisions, mistakes, documentation, and the ability to explain what you learned from it. That's where the experience comes from. And so to kind of break it down more about what experience actually means, um, what hiring managers mean when they ask for experience, right? Experience is not time spent doing activities necessarily. It's the ability to investigate problems, right? Make decisions under uncertainty, explain your reasoning, and learn from those results. When a job posting asks for 2 years of experience, hiring managers want evidence that you can identify and frame security problems clearly. that you can evaluate different approaches and choose one with justification, that you can implement your approach and adapt when things don't work as expected. They want to see that you can document your work so others can understand it, that you can explain what you learned and what you do differently next time. That can communicate technical concepts to people with different backgrounds, right? These capabilities develop through practice, reflection, communication. They don't develop automatically just because you spend time in a lab environment. Two candidates might both list home labs on their resumes. One can explain their problem they investigated while they chose specific tools, what happened when their initial approach failed, and what they learned from troubleshooting. The other can only describe the tools they installed and the tutorials they completed. The first candidate has the experience. The second candidate has been busy. This distinction matters because security work consistently involves ambiguity, right? Incomplete information and situations where the textbook answer doesn't quite fit. The hiring managers need evidence that you can think through problems, not just follow instructions. So what do you do? How do you change your approach after all this? Well, the solution isn't to build more complex labs or earn additional certifications, at least not right now. The solution is to approach your learning activities just differently. Every project, lab, exercise, or investigation should answer a specific question or solve a particular problem. Before you start, write down what you're trying to learn or accomplish and why it matters. As you work, document your decisions. When you choose one approach over the other, explain why. When something doesn't work as expected, document what happened and how you troubleshot it. When you discover something that surprises you, write it down. What you learned from this. This documentation matters more than the complexity of your environment. A simple project investigating one focused question with clear documentation of your reasoning process provides a much stronger evidence capability than elaborate environment that you can't fully explain. So write down documentation, for someone who hasn't seen your work yet, right? Explain what problem you investigated, what approach you chose and why, what results you observed, what you learned or you would do differently. This transforms activity completion into demonstrated judgment. And here's something most candidates miss. Include projects that didn't work as expected. Think about that for a second, right? Document what went wrong, why it went wrong, and what you learned from the experience. The ability to explain failures and learn from them demonstrates professional maturity, and that many experienced practitioners still lack. Security work involves constant troubleshooting, unexpected results, and adaptation. Showing that you can handle setbacks and learn from them, provides valuable evidence of how you perform under actual working conditions. So if you're already working in IT, I want to mention this, that many candidates overlook that help desk work, system admin, network support, and other IT roles provide direct exposure to security concepts, even when the job title doesn't say cybersecurity. If you work in IT, you already handle security-related tasks. You manage user access and permissions. You respond to potential security incidents. You balance, security requirements with usability. You implement security controls. You educate users about security policies. The problem is that most candidates don't recognize or document these activities as security experience. Start identifying the security aspects of your current work. When you handle an access request, you're making decisions about least privilege and need to know. When you troubleshoot a system problem, you're considering whether the issue might indicate compromise. When you implement a new system, you're configuring security settings and explaining security requirements to users. Document these experiences with the same approach you use for lab projects. Explain the problem, the decision you made, the constraints you worked within, what you learned, understanding how systems actually work, how users behave, how organizations operate, and how just things break provides foundation that pure security training can't replicate. Security professionals need to understand the environments they protect. Your current IT experience has value. You need to recognize it, document it, and articulate it how it relates to security work. So as far as the next sort of topic about creating accountability, here's something that also could change the equation a bit. Home labs provide valuable learning environments, but they lack one critical element: real consequences. When you work, when your work actually affects real people or real organizations, your decisions matter differently. You must consider constraints you can't control. You must explain recommendations to non-technical stakeholders. You must deliver results that actually work in production environments. Helping a nonprofit secure their systems, contributing to open source security projects, or assisting community organizations creates accountability that home labs just can't replicate. This experience demonstrates professionalism and reliability, not just technical skill. It shows you can work with real requirements, real deadlines, and real people who depend on your work. Look for opportunities where you must explain your security recommendations to people without technical backgrounds. Practice translating security concepts into business terms. Learn to balance perfect security with practical constraints. These situations develop skills that many technical capable candidates lack. Approach these opportunities professionally. Deliver what you promise. Document your work, ask for feedback, treat volunteer work with the same professionalism you'd bring to a paid employment. So what do you do right now? Right? You don't need to start new projects or build more complex environments. You need to change how they approach the work already you're doing right now. Right? Choose one recent learning activity, lab, exercise, or project. Document it properly. Explain what problem you investigated, what approach you chose and why, what decisions you made, what results you observed, what you learned. Write this documentation for someone who can't see your lab. Be specific about your reasoning. Include what didn't work and how you adapted. Create a public repository, blog, or portfolio where you share this work. Focus demonstrating your investigation process and reasoning, not just your conclusions. If you currently work in IT, identify one security relevant aspect of your job this week. Document how you approached it, what decisions you made, what constraints you worked within. For your next learning activity, choose a project that requires you to make decisions under uncertainty rather than following step-by-step instructions. Investigate a question that doesn't have one obvious answer. Document your reasoning process as you actually work through it. Look for one volunteer opportunity where your security work will affect real people or organizations. Start small. Focus on situations that require you to explain recommendations to non-technical stakeholders. These changes don't require permission, expensive tools, or even more certifications. They require approaching your work differently and communicating about it effectively. So to kind of close all this out, the experience paradox feels impossible because candidates focus on activities rather than evidence. You complete tutorials, build labs, and earn certifications, and then wonder why hiring managers still see you as inexperienced. The solution isn't doing more of the same activities. The solution is demonstrating judgment, decision-making, and learning through documentation and communication. You don't need employer permission to build credible experience. You need to investigate problems, make decisions, document your approach, and explain your reasoning. You need to show that you can think through ambiguous situations and learn from those results. Start with the work you're already doing. Document it properly, communicate clearly, focus on demonstrating how you think, not just what you completed. That's how you build experience that hiring managers actually recognize. So if you found this helpful, I've got more resources on building a cybersecurity career in the description below. And if you're working on documenting your projects and want feedback on your approach, leave a comment. I read them. Subscribe for more of this every week, and I'll see you in the next one.